All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dave Usher. I'm the product manager for the Kuali Research product line, and we are really excited today to share the newest development and release of the conflict of interest module with you all. There's been a lot of anticipation about it. We've been working on this for a few months now, and it was released about 10 days ago now, a week and a half ago, or 2 weeks ago now. It is available. What you're going to see today is available. And we'll try to get through as much of it as we can. So, little logistics before we start. Everybody is going to be placed on mute. If you have questions as you're watching this session today, please enter them in the questions section, and we'll address them later. And with that, let's start our webinar. All right. This conflict of interest module that you're about to see represents a new methodology in Kuali's design process. We now have on staff a world-class design team, and in March they started the process of contacting and interviewing our customers, doing a number of on-campus visits, and we worked with more than 10 of our customers in this process. Our designer would go and interview people. How do you deal with conflict of interest disclosures? What is your process? And we would work through all of those. And Gary would take that information back from each of the customers he visited, and he'd bring it back and develop static screenshots and wireframes. And he'd work with the institutions and review them with them, and he'd take their feedback and he'd make modifications. That process went on for a couple of months, and as he was doing that, our developers were starting to code and put the meat behind the wireframes that he was working on. That whole process has taken us 5 or 6 months, and this module that you're about to see was released in October. So the velocity of our development has increased significantly. Our involvement with customers is much tighter. We have a great group of customers, a very big community who is active in helping us define the modules and its functionality. Many schools do things differently, even with conflict of interest disclosures. And Gary would work with them to try to reconcile those differences in business processes. And when he could and it made sense, we would build that into the application. And when we couldn't, there are still times when schools need to do things differently. So the system is built highly configurable and really easy for administrators to set the system up to work on your campus. So as we go through today, Jen Flack, who is our presenter today, is going to show us not just how a PI would disclose any potential conflicts, but also how an administrator would review those and process disclosures that were submitted. So with that, let me introduce Jen Flack. Jen has been with the Kuali COIS community in a QA and functional specialist role with the compliance modules for more than 8 years. Prior to that, she worked with NIH for more than 10 years in the National Cancer Institute, and more than 3 years as one of their QA specialists. So I'm going to turn this over to Jen now. And let Jen take us through the new conflict of interest module. All right, Jen.
Thank you, Dave. Yeah, thanks, Dave. And thank all of you for joining this webinar. As Dave mentioned, today we will walk through the annual COI disclosure process from both the researcher and the COI administrator perspectives. And then I will show you how easily the COI module can be configured for your institution's processes. So first, I'm going to log in as a researcher. So Della Woods is my researcher, and she is going to start the annual COI disclosure process. So as she first goes into the system, she sees her COI dashboard, and she has the ability to update her annual disclosure. At this point, this is the first disclosure she has in the system, so she just gets started. Here, when the researcher kicks off their disclosure process, they're presented with exactly the steps that they'll need to follow to go through that process, and they're taken through that in a sequential manner. One of the things that we did in developing this module is to make sure that what we presented to the researcher was presented in digestible pieces, so we weren't giving them a lot of information at once, and we're only presenting the data that they need to fill out to complete the process, to keep it very streamlined and simple for the end user. Also, we have configurable instructions on each page, so the researcher can go and get some more. So next, I'm going to answer each of these questions. For this first question, you can see it's my beginning question out of 4 questions. I will select yes. In this case, I'm presented with an additional question. There is the ability to add sub-questions for yes-no questions to get more information on that answer. So here I will add some comments to explain my initial answer. And after I've done that, I'm able to move on to the next step. So I click Next. Also, as I did that, you can see over here, we have a progress wheel. The progress wheel is an indicator of where you are in the process, how far along you are. A lot of the researchers that come into the system to do a COI disclosure will be doing it once a year or maybe a couple of times a year, but they won't be doing it frequently. So we wanted to give them an idea of when they go in to do their work, about how long it would take them. So that's what the process wheel indicates here. They can see where they are in the process. And if they have to leave at some point and come back, they can do that. So I'm going to answer my next questions. Again, they're presented one by one, so the researcher is just looking at one question at a time, can answer them, and move on. At the end, they're presented with all of the questions, their answers for the entire questionnaire, so they can review what they've put before they move. So at this point, I can say, oops, I answered no, but in reading this again, I really should have answered it yes. So I can go in and edit my answer that easily. And now I'm going to move on to the next step, which is the financial entities. So at this point, you can see the questionnaire step has been checked because I finished that, and I'm now at the financial entities step. And my progress wheel has moved on. I have new instructions that pertain to this screen, and I can move on to add my new financial entities. If I didn't have any entities, I can select I have no entities to disclose, and then I'll be jumped through to the last step where I can certify. However, I do have financial entities, so I'm going to include them here. I'm going to enter my financial entity, and after I've entered the name, then I'm presented with additional questions asking about this financial entity, which I must answer. So I'm doing that here. I also have the option to add an attachment. One of the things that's nice about our new attachment functionality is you have the option to upload an attachment, or you can drag and drop a file from your desktop, for example, like I just did. So it's that easy to add an attachment. So here I'm adding an attachment that's relevant to this financial entity, and I'm going to click Next. And after adding the financial entity, I'm presented with the questions about my relationship with the financial entity. So here I have the various categories of my relationship, and I can select the person that has that relationship. Again, these things are configurable, so as a COI admin, I can configure the people that are relevant to the relationship as well as the relationship categories and the details about them. I'll show you how that works later in this demo. At this point, I'm going to say, as myself, I have stock, and I don't have a lot. I can specify how much I have and add my stock. I can also indicate that my spouse has a position within this company. They are a board member and they don't get any money, and so on. So I can submit any number of relationships that are relevant to this financial entity. I'm going to submit this and save that, and I'm going to add another one real quick. Here, I'm going to add this financial entity as a travel entity. So this is the information about the sponsor. Next, I will go in and say that the relationship I have for this entity is travel. So my test corporation sent me on travel in the amount of $200. If I try to add the relationship without the required information, I cannot. So I must finish my data about my travel. And then I can add my relationship. So here's my travel relationship that I just entered. And I'm going to submit that. So at this point, I have two financial entities. Another thing to notice is I can look at the summary details of my relationship. If I want to review what I've done, I can edit it if needed, or I can close that out. I also have the option to deactivate a financial entity. So at this point, this is my first annual disclosure. I've just added these entities, so they really are active, but I'll demonstrate quickly how you can easily deactivate a financial entity. For example, I come back in a year and I no longer have a relationship with that entity, I could just deactivate it. And at this point, it's removed from my active list and it will not be presented to me as a financial entity that I need to disclose for this disclosure. And I can likewise go over to my inactive financial entities and reactivate one to bring it back. If, for example, I had no relationship, then I got stock in that company again, I can just reactivate them. So now I'm going to move on to the next step, which is project declarations. In project declarations, I have two projects that have been brought in from Kuali Research. In this case, Della Woods has two proposals. If she had protocols or awards, they would appear here as well. So for these two proposals, she has not declared her relationship with the project and with the financial entity. So I see this action required message here in both cases. So at this point, I can go in and update my project and indicate my relationships with my financial entities, or I can look at this from the financial entity view. So here I'm presented with my two projects. If I change the view, I'm presented with my two financial entities, and then within that, I can look at my projects. So depending upon how the investigator wants to look at this screen, they can either look at things by project or by financial entity, and also that can help them in filling out their relationships easier, however they want to look at it. The other thing that's available on this screen is the ability to set all of the relationships in a particular area at one time. So I could say I have no conflict for either of these and do that with one click. But I'm going to go in and reflect on each and say this one has no conflict, this one maybe, or maybe not. I'll stick with no conflict and click done. So at this point, I've completed one financial entity, but now I have to do the same and say for my financial entity called test, what is the relationship I have with my projects? So again, I'm going to say no conflict across the board. And you can see my status on each is no conflict because that's all I selected at this point. So now I'm going to go to the next step. And here I'm presented with the certification. Also, if I needed to go back for some reason, I'm able to do that. The thing that the system prevents is you going forward before you've completed the information needed to move on to the next step, but you can go backwards. So I'm going to go back to certification. I've seen that I finished my steps. I'm at my last step. Here I can add an additional attachment for the overall disclosure level, or I could go ahead and read the certification and acknowledge it. Notice at this point the submit option is grayed out. That's because I have to acknowledge the certification before I'm able to submit. So after I've read this and acknowledged, then I can submit my annual disclosure. So now that I've finished my annual disclosure, submitted it for approval to the COI Administrator Office, as a researcher, I can sign out and move on. So now, what I'm going to do is log in as a COI Administrator and process this disclosure. So I've logged out as a researcher. I'm logging in as a COI admin. When I log in as a COI admin, you can see that I have a very similar screen. I have my COI dashboard in case I need to work on my annual disclosure, but I also have this admin menu over here. This was not available to the researcher because they do not have the permissions to carry out any of the admin functions. So I'm going to look at my admin menu, and here I have the options to go to my admin dashboard or configuration. At this point, I'm going to go to my admin dashboard, where I will look at the submitted disclosures and process them. So here I can see that I've had a few disclosures that were submitted today. I've got a list view that's on the main part of the screen. I can also go and search for different disclosures and filter my disclosures based on a number of criteria. So one is the date range, another is the status, and also I can go straight to a particular reporter and search for their name. So if I just want to find Della Wood's disclosure, because I know that's just been submitted, I can go in and find that one directly. When I clear my filters, then others will show up. So what I'm going to do now is show you how big this list can get. And at this point, I'm just going to focus on Della Woods. You can see her disclosure is highlighted, and it's her disclosure that I had selected, so I see that detail view. One of the things to notice is how different this screen is from the researcher screen. On the researcher screen, we wanted to present the information in small pieces and walk them through the process step by step. The admin and how they interact with the system is very different. They want to be able to see the list of the disclosures that they have to act on, be able to organize these, and then when they choose a particular disclosure, they want to be able to see all of the details at once so they can review it and respond to it. So We've got the questionnaire section up here, and they can just scroll down and see all of the other parts, the financial entities, any attachments for them, the various relationships, and the project declarations. So at this point, I can go and look at the whole disclosure and then start adding review comments. So I'm going to go in and add some review comments. Note that I'm able to do this at a very specific level. So here I'm going into a particular question, and I'm going to comment here. Please provide more information. Then, if I click this box here for the recipient, my comment will be visible to the investigator when I send this disclosure back. So if I don't click this, I can keep this comment as an internal admin comment, a note to myself or other COI admins. But I want this comment to go back to the researcher. So I'm going to indicate that and submit. So now you can see that I've got a comment here for question 1. I can close that, go through my disclosure a little bit more, and come to a financial entity and add another comment. Not clear. And we could ask them to clarify their answer here, or if there's an inconsistency with this financial entity and how they filled that out, we can ask that. So I will do one more review comment. You can also see after I've added a comment, the 0 here is turned to 1 because there's one comment now associated with this section. I'm going to do one more at the project declaration level. It's specific to a specific financial entity and project, and say, does not seem right, and send that back. So now I've made 3 comments in different places. I can also view all of my comments at once. I can see which section they were entered in. I was the one who put in the comments, and this is the date and the comment. So that's a quick overview of all the comments if I want to see them at once. At this point, I'm going to send the disclosure back. I will show you some of the other options that are available to the admin in a moment. So when I go to send the disclosure back, I can send a note saying, please address these issues. And send back the notification. So at this point, the disclosure goes into a status of sent back from the administrator's view. It will kick off an email notification that will go to the researcher saying that there are some items within their annual disclosure that they need to address. So now I'm going to sign out as a COI admin, and I'm going to go back in as the researcher to address those comments. So I'm going to go back in as our researcher, Della Woods. And when I come to my COI dashboard this time, I've got my annual disclosure, and it says updates required. And I have the opportunity to revise. So based on the review of the COI admin and the COI admin sending this back, I can go in and revise my disclosure. And here I'm presented with a different view. So instead of being presented with the whole disclosure, even the things that were correct and the COI admin didn't have questions about, I'm only shown those areas where review comments were given. So I've got the section of my questionnaire, my financial entities, and my project declarations. And for each, I have the comment listed, and I have 2 actions I can take. One is to respond, and one is to revise. And I can take both of these actions. Before I move on, one thing I am going to show you is from this screen, we have something called contrast mode, and this is the ability to change the look of the screen for someone who is visually impaired so that it's black and white and crisp versus the regular view. That's available on all of the screens, and it's something we plan to put into our UI moving forward as part of our effort to make sure that our UI is accessible. So now I'm going to move on and revise this comment and add more detail, and then hit done. And it's changed my answer. I can also respond and say that I added more detail if I want. I don't have to do that. I can see here that I've revised it and responded, and now I have this needs attention symbol has turned into a check mark. So I have 2 more things to address before I can submit. Again, see how the submit button is grayed out? It will be that way until I address all the issues that I need to. So here I'm going to just respond and say, I think this is clear. And done. So I've responded, and that's sufficient to address the issue. And then here I'm going to change this to potential relationship. So do that. And I'll also say changed. You look through, and now I've addressed all of the review comments, and I'm comfortable with my responses, so I'm going to submit my disclosure back for review again. When I go to do that, I'm presented with the certification again, and I must acknowledge it before I can submit. So I'll do that here. And now my disclosure has gone back to the COI administrator. I can see here that it was resubmitted, and I can also see here when it was last reviewed. And then I'm going to sign out, and I'm going to go back in as a COI administrator and finish up this process. So signing out as the researcher, going back in as the COI admin. And I'm going to go back to my administration dashboard. And here I can see that Della Woods has resubmitted their disclosure. So I'm going to go straight into her disclosure. And I can see where she's addressed her issues and commented. So here, when I sent it back, it only had 1 comment. Now I can see that it has 2, and that's because it has both the COI administrator comment and that of the researcher. So there's this dialogue back and forth. So if this disclosure had to go back to the research again, this thread would continue. Close that here. I can look at the comments that were made, review everything, and then say, hey, this looks good now. If I needed to add a management plan, I could go into additional review and do that. I could upload a management plan here. I can look over the review comments one more time to see all the back and forth. At this point, I'm sure that everything's addressed. It looks good, so I'm going to approve it. So now I've completed the process for the annual disclosure. The researcher will now know that their disclosure has been approved, and it will be available for them to view in their disclosure archives if they wish. Because I'm currently logged in as the admin, I'm now going to show you the configuration screens. So this is where, as the admin, I can go in and configure how I want the COI module to behave. So the first thing that we have available here is our general disclosure configuration. The main functionalities we have available now are annual disclosure, and then we are building out the travel log. I didn't enable that for this demo, but if I enabled this, then it would present another option for the researcher where they could go in and log in their travel, do travel entries on a rolling basis that would then later be included in their annual disclosure. So they can add travel log information outside of an annual disclosure. That's what that functionality is, and we're working on that currently. The other thing I can configure here is the disclosure due dates. So in this case, it's set for an annual, a static annual due date where everyone discloses on the same day of the year. I could set this as a rolling annual due date, in which case it would look at when the reporter submitted their disclosure to determine when it was next due. So it'd be on a researcher by researcher basis instead of everybody submitting on the same time. The next thing I'll look at in configuration is a screening questionnaire. And as part of this, and you'll see in these other sections too, I can also add instructions. So on the questionnaire step, which is a very beginning step of the annual disclosure on the researcher side, where I pulled down those instructions that were available for the user, this is where they're configured. So for the screening questions, that questionnaire area, I can go in and modify this instruction text to be what is most useful to my users. I can also go in and manage this questionnaire. So if you recall, when we went through the annual disclosure, Della Woods, when she first went in, a question in which she answered yes. And when she answered yes, she was given the please explain question. The reason that occurred is we have a parent question here, and then down here we have a sub-question, question 1A, that says display if the parent is yes. If she had answered no to the first question, then she would not have been presented with the second question. So we do support branching questions. At this point, it's at one child level, and it's for yes/no questions. In order to change a question, to make it a sub-question, it's as easy as pushing the question in and giving it an indent. So now I've taken what was question 3 at the same level of question 2, and I've moved it to make it question 2A. And I could say, oh, answer this only when the parent answer is no. Otherwise, it won't be presented. So I can change that here. Another thing to note about the configuration screens is I have explicit save and cancel actions here. So as I'm configuring, until I'm sure that I want these changes saved, the system is not making those changes. So as you're changing configuration, the system isn't changing unless you're saving it. So in this case, I'm just going to cancel. Another example of how you can arrange your questionnaire, I can change the order of questions simply by moving them and moving them back. So it's very easy to organize the order of your questions and the level of your questions. Also adding a new question. There's several types of questions that you can include. The most common one in the screening questionnaire is yes/no. Based on our interviews with users, that's the most used. But we also have yes/no, not applicable. We have the ability to set up a question that has a number as an answer, a date as an answer, in which case our date picker, our calendar widget will show up as the mechanism for answering the question. The text area, an example of that is the please explain question right here. And then there's also the multi-select question, which I'll show you when we get to the next area of questionnaire, which is within the financial entities, because one of those questions is actually multiple select. So at this point, I'm not going to make any changes as the admin. I just wanted to show you how this works. I'm going to cancel out. And now that I've finished looking at my screening questionnaire, I'm going to go into my financial entities questionnaire. Here again, I've got an instructions area where I can set instructions that are specific to the financial entities step within the annual disclosure. And I've got my questions, which you saw that were presented each time I added, or if I had gone to edit any of my financial entities. If you recall, when we looked at the disclosure from the researcher perspective, we had the name of the financial entity, and then all of these items here that are the 4 questions were presented at once for the user versus the screening questions, which were presented one by one. So even though intentionally these data were presented very different for the researcher, they're configured the same way on the administrator side. So even though they end up getting displayed within the annual disclosure for the researcher differently, you manage them the same way when you're configuring the system. So that way you don't have 2 different ways of trying to set up what are essentially questions within your disclosure. So I would use this section the same way as I did my screening questionnaire. I could add new questions. I could edit a question. So this is the example of the multi-select. So for the multi-select, I have added these 3 options. I can add a 4th option simply by typing it in and pressing enter. So now I have a 4th option that would be presented to the user when they're completing their financial entities. Or I could remove that and say, never mind, I don't think I want to do that. Or just undo my changes. So that's how you can manage a multi-select question. It's that easy. The next step in configuration is the relationship matrix. So there's 2 main sections to this. The first is determining who are the people types that you want the reporter to disclose about. So in addition to self, you may have spouse. You may say, oh, other doesn't really mean anything to us, but I do want to add dependents. And so I do that just by adding another and clicking done. So now I've changed the people that will be presented when the reporter goes in and they're asked to give their relationship details about a given financial entity. Down here is where I can configure the categories. So I've got all of them selected. If I decided I don't want to use other, that doesn't really matter. I could unclick that and save the changes. Or I could go in and look at a particular category and say I want to change some of the data elements within that category. So here I could say I don't want to ask for the type at all and just remove that. Or I could keep the type and change certain aspects about it. The values, I could add an additional one, I could remove one, or I could go in and make changes. For example, if I didn't want to use dollar amounts, I could go in and use percentages instead, for example, and save that. So that's how you can go through for each of these categories within your relationship matrix and configure those based on the data that your institution cares about collecting. So lastly is the customization of the certification statement. So here you've got the instructions you can include, and then also you can put in your certification text. You can choose whether or not to require the checkbox agreement. If I unclick that, then that will not be required as part of the submission process. I'm going to keep that. So that concludes the demonstration for the COI annual disclosure process and the configuration.
This was a great session, and I thank you, Jen, for leading us through that. Our next webinar is going to be on December 15th, when we're going to go over the Kuali research reporting and analytics capabilities. We're really excited about that too. There's a ton of embedded functionality in the application, and we'll lead you through that. There's been a lot of interest and questions on reporting, and we all know how important that is. I want to thank you all for joining us. We had a great turnout for today's session. If anyone is interested in more information, please contact Jen or myself or go to the website. we're happy to schedule further in-depth demos if you want them. And I want to thank you all very much for joining us today.